Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, good evening. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining our LaRouche PAC Strategic Overview. Tonight, we'll be joined by Barbara Boyd. I will announce again that LaRouche PAC is changing its name, and you'll be hearing more about that. We have also changed our action PAC from to Promethean Action, and I believe I've given out the website for that new LaRouche PAC action to Promethean Action, which is prometheanaction.com. So you can learn more about that. In the meantime, you can continue to look at our updates and material, very important material on LaRouche PAC, and we will continue to give you updates on the process over the next coming months of the change of our name. Now, tonight, Barbara Boyd is our speaker, and the discussion is going to be the end of the post-World War II British Imperial Order. She's going to take us through a look at what is happening internationally as we're seeing a revolution taking place in the United States and throughout Europe and rising up against the rules-based international order. She's also going to tell us where Trump continues to outflank and expose the bankrupt and incompetent elites. So we'll turn it over to Barbara for her strategic overview, and after that, we'll take your questions and comments. Okay, so one moment. All right, you got the floor, Barbara.
Okay. So look, I think that we're at a very critical inflection point, which people actually have to think about and internalize. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about it a lot, we put out, or we'll be putting out in print form now, are what we call the police dossier on why the British assassinate American presidents. And that caused me to really take a look again in more depth than I have in a while at the Kennedy assassination. And, I really started to think about the comparison really between what happened after that seminal event in American history and what's going on now. You could almost call it a comparison between two coups d'etats. And I'm going to sort of keep that theme running through actually laying out for you where we stand across the international order at this point. But, I'd like to take you back for a second to the period right after World War II, when what Joe Biden keeps talking about as the rules-based international order, so-called, that we have to defend as if it's life and death, that order is the representative of democracy, so-called, and really all that particular order is the modern name for the British financial empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, if you want to be more precise about the historical nomenclature. And I went back and looked at a book by L. Fletcher Prouty on the JFK assassination. For those who are not Kennedy assassination buffs, L. Fletcher Prouty is a very important name. He is, in the Oliver Stone movie JFK, a figure played by Donald Sutherland, named Mr. X, the guy who keeps tipping off DA Jim Garrison as to the actual order of things. That's L. Fletcher Prouty, a person who sat at the center of the inception of this horrendous world, rules-based international order within the Pentagon in a key post, which was actually to run all of the military components of CIA operations set into motion as a result of the death of Franklin Roosevelt, the rise of Harry Truman, the continuance of that Rockefeller, we'll call it faction, Rockefeller-Morgan faction, which gave us a lot of the Eisenhower administration leading up to the Kennedy administration itself. And in his book, JFK, he has a very interesting description of the axiomatic assumptions of the elites that he actually was responsible for ferrying across the world at various critical points in the history of the world post-World War II. And he says basically there are four really central belief structures. One is the right of conquest, that the victor in any conflict has the right to all of the property gained from the conflict, regardless of the consequences of that particular action. In fact, that rule is what we see playing out now in the horrible conflict and horrible genocide taking place in the Middle East. Malthusianism, which he emphasized, was a key aspect of this, that these people actually hate human beings and don't believe that they have a system which can actually support a growing population. And indeed, if you look at the demographics across the world, you'll see huge population declines as the result of the implementation of these policies in that period. You'll see that most populations aren't growing. And in fact, most nations have a demographic crisis. That is, that they have many more deaths than they're having births to sustain the population and the state itself. A belief in Darwinism of a specific form, i.e., survival of the fittest. And since we're the elites, we must be the fittest, i.e., kind of a narcissistic belief in themselves. He said it also was a belief in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I think that's a pretty important observation, because he says what that meant is that we abandoned hypotheses, we abandoned the search for truth, and we assumed that everything was a result of random processes, that science itself didn't really exist anymore, and that God himself actually, as opposed to what Einstein said, threw dice. Events are random. And most importantly, he said that they largely believed in themselves as a secret, and I underline this, largely invisible cabal, a cabal above leaders of states, a cabal above congressmen, a cabal among even, things like the Trilateral Commission or the Bilderberg Society, or all of these gathering spots. They were invisible, and they made it their point to manipulate events without being identified or seen. And finally, he characterized it, which I thought was also fairly perspective, is a place where, because of Malthusianism and because of their hatred of human beings, and because they couldn't figure out how to actually harness human creativity, which is the nature of human beings, they believe that nations and states are actually dependent upon war. That if you don't have wars, you can't define yourself as a nation. And that the only way to rally the population of nations is to do so through what he called wars which are never actually won, because to take them to their limits, you would threaten nuclear conflagration. After all, we now have the bomb. But wars which were largely purposeless and undertaken as population wars, largely wars to kill the maximum amount of human beings through, a process in which everybody basically couldn't figure out what the goal was and where these wars actually got started in the first instance. A pretty interesting, discussion of the rules-based international order from his perspective. Lyndon LaRouche, a little bit later on, said really in the modern period, the character of these people is literally pure population control enforced through killer wars and through the green policies, which of course have been the central feature of Joe Biden's economic and foreign policies. Green rules to actually kill people, which is what it is, because if societies don't advance and progress, essentially you're consigning people to entropy and to the kinds of things which go on when societies are governed by pessimism and the culture of a dark age. So with that kind of backing, what I'm about to tell you is that all of that is coming, thank God, to an end. We're at a precipice right now where, through the courage of Donald Trump in the United States, and I'll go through this, and the courage of populations internationally, we're seeing an upheaval and a complete rejection of this horrendous post-war rules-based international order. So I'll start to describe where we are. Right now, you're looking at two wars, very concretely. They are population wars. Let's not, pull any bones about it. Through the actions of Joe Biden, Victoria Nuland, and this horrible bunch of people we have running the United States right now, in conjunction with these idiots in Britain, we have a situation in which the nation of Ukraine is being obliterated. The idea is that we're running what is called a proxy war against Russia. These people are stupid enough to believe that they're exhausting Russia because they have no actual knowledge of Russian history, Russian culture, or the ability of the Russian people to actually rally patriotically once attacked. So what the situation there is now is that through the House, coming to the House of Representatives from our Senate, if it gets out of the Senate, is a new round of billions and billions of dollars to go to this crazy proxy war in Ukraine, which has done nothing but obliterate most of the Ukrainian population and throw the entirety of Western Europe into a depression and drastically impacted economies worldwide, because it impacted the ability of the world's energy trade, which of course drives all economies. And where that stands right now is Biden is desperately trying, and the people behind Biden are desperately trying to avoid admitting that Ukraine is lost, because to do so at this point in the American election process, and also in the election process which is going on in Europe at the same time, you risk overthrowing the entirety of the system like NATO and other such manifestations, which have governed the Western economies since World War II. That's really what's at stake in the admission that, when you think about it, Ukraine is lost. The leaders of France, the leaders of Germany, all of the leaders of the former East Bloc states have banked their entire regimes on supporting this crazy war in Ukraine, which is about to be lost. Their fallback position is the British are openly talking about putting special forces on the ground in Ukraine. They've been talking about that throughout the last week. Basically having a kind of retreat if Russia stages a major offensive, where the capital of Ukraine would be moved to Lviv, and the Poles would come in also for a buffer or safety zone against Russia. I don't need to tell you that this type of strategy is indeed a red line, as has been articulated many times by Putin, as to what would happen should NATO forces become directly involved in that war in Ukraine. I note parenthetically that Tucker Carlson is in Russia right now, apparently. He may or may not do an interview with Putin. It has the neoconservatives here in the United States in a complete froth. The wonderful Bill Kristol took to Twitter today to say that what the United States must do is not let Tucker back in the country at this point in time to actually air any such interview. In the Middle East, you have a situation where Biden and his colleagues are desperately trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat, because what you have going on is an obvious genocidal Israeli response to an attack by Hamas, which was very real. And what Biden is trying to do from the outside is to somehow impose a two-state solution on Israel, with guarantees from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Gulf and Middle East for Israeli security. I don't know that that has any chance of actually happening. There is a prospect that there could be a ceasefire. Israel is having difficulties actually meeting the grand plan of exterminating Hamas, which was not going to be possible in the first instance anyway. And in the United States and across the world, the impact on Muslim populations has been to basically, at least in Michigan and other places in the United States, drive them away from the warmongers and drive them away from anybody close to Joe Biden. And you've got to sort of think about that Trump couldn't get in there soon enough. At the same time, throughout Europe, you have a massive, massive revolt against the green policies. Across Europe, it's not only a revolt against the green policies, as I've mentioned, it's a revolt against the war policy per se, and it's also very much tied up with our own problems of open borders and immigration. A policy which has not really a lot to do with all of the ways that it's portrayed in terms of races and invasions and that type of thing. It is an overall policy by the oligarchy to run a modern slave trade, and that is to actually drive low-wage immigrants into an economy in which they envision that they can make these entire enslaved populations, the labor force, replacing any type of advanced labor force, because in their green society, an advanced labor force, after all, is not desired or even vaguely necessary. So that it's not just here in the United States that you see a massive popular resistance, which has driven the elites crazy and which they do not understand. It is happening throughout Europe, and there are major elections also in Europe during the next year, 2024, which will shape how Europe actually responds. Now, they're basically hampered in Europe, as LaRouche and we have pointed out on numerous occasions, by the fact that they're run as parliamentary systems. They don't have a constitution. They don't have the levers of potential political power, which we have because of the unique way our constitution sets up our government. Instead, it's a pure parliamentary system, which, as we know, throughout history has allowed for maximum manipulation from behind the scenes by elite forces who are never put up for election or anything else. Now, the gambit, which is being raised both here against Trump and also in Europe, coming out of the recent Davos conference of the elites, is to try and impose massive censorship as the way to confront this popular uprising, without necessarily resorting yet to force, although pretty clearly in terms of the farmers' demonstrations, which took place in Brussels last week and involved massive, massive, massive amounts of tractors tying up everything in sight, there was the beginnings of a massive kind of police response to that, with that inflaming the population even more. In the United States, of course, we have the lawfare, which has resulted in the revolt, the absolute revolt of the US population against what these guys are attempting to impose. I'll give you just a short summary of where all of that stands. You have the silly January 6th case in Washington, D.C., which last week was removed from the docket by the judge because Trump's appeal that presidential immunity shields him from any criminal prosecution is still pending before the three-judge panel at the D.C. Circuit Court, with no date set for when that might come into fruition as an opinion. The idea is that one judge, Karen LaCraft Henderson, it's said by those who are speculating on this, and I think it's a pretty good speculation, she's going to write a dissent, and because she's the senior judge, she's entitled, per judicial decorum, to actually take her sweet time about it. Now, there's a huge uproar from the lawfare people about this. They're going nuts because, of course, their entire scheduling was we have to get Trump tried and convicted, at least in D.C., before the elections. And we've got to drum it home to the population that the reason why they can't vote for Trump if he's convicted is that that would be just too freaky for the population to bear. How can you have a president who's acting as president from jail? Of course, that's not what's going to happen, indeed, if he's elected president, but that's their line at this point in terms of trying to scare the hell out of the population. Then we have the Georgia RICO case by none other than the infamous now Fani Willis, the prosecutor down there who was caught having an affair and spending huge amounts of public money on her lover, who she appointed as chief prosecutor in the case, who has no experience in ever bringing a criminal felony case to trial, and rewarded him with a salary way above what anybody else was earning on the case, and then proceeded to use his earnings to actually go on various luxury cruises and everywhere else, and that included actually going to Washington, D.C. and charging the taxpayers of the state of Georgia for 24 hours of legal work, which mostly appears to be coordinating with the Biden White House to actually bring the Georgia indictments against Trump. As a side note, I note that the guy who actually discovered all of this about Fani and brought it forward as a motion is a guy by the name of Mike Roman, who did a lot of the opposition research in the past for Donald Trump and is a defendant with him in the Georgia crazy RICO case. I guess prosecutors should take note that it's kind of stupid to indict the Oppo guy because he might actually find out a whole lot about what's going on. There used to be a slogan among the establishment when Mr. LaRouche was alive and in his prime that went around kind of as a bumper sticker, which was, don't mess with LaRouche if you've got something to hide. The big thing also, which is happening in terms of the Florida case, is that they're showing how defensive they've actually become by writing press releases instead of motions and trying to discount what is rapidly appearing to come to fruition in terms of proofs in that case, and that is that there was direct coordination between the National Archives and the Biden White House in setting up Trump and setting up this whole crazy scenario around classified documents and misuse thereof, coming directly out of the Biden White House and not coming somehow out of some routine inquiry by the National Archives as to when Trump turned over documents that they had classified markings on them, which is what they've maintained up to this date. So in other words, all of these cases are blowing up. And the more they, as Trump said over the weekend, the more they indict, the more he rises in the polls, because the American people are really quite sick of this whole thing and are in revolt. Actually, there's no other way to describe it, against the peculiar form of the rules-based international order and the green policy as it has been imposed on the United States. Uh, you know, the basic argument behind this border bill, which, God knows we have 6.5 million people who come into the country. They have no idea where they are. They have no idea who they are. And basically the argument being made by the Democrats and by their globalist sponsors is that this is necessary to cure a labor shortage in the economy and is necessary to tame inflation. That's the argument. One might point out that the labor force in the United States has been poisoned by drugs for the last decades, has not recovered from COVID, and is in the process of being completely dumbed down through an educational system which is designed to produce a low wage servant slave-like population. What Trump has done, at least in his interviews with Maria Bartiromo over the weekend, is he's decided he's going to go for the whole thing, as we have talked about. What is necessary to unite the country at this point is a victory for Trump in 2024, which crosses party lines, which crosses all of the types of divisive lines which have been set up to keep the population at war with one another. So he's talking about going into states which people have conceded for years are blue states. He's talking about campaigning at Madison Square Garden and in the Bronx. He's going for the union vote in both the UAW and the Teamsters. He's reaching out through Tim Scott and other national figures to actually create the basis for reviving our cities, for turning them away from being the hellholes that they are into images of beauty, stopping the crime, stopping the violence, stopping the drugs, all of which are one policy there. And, really presenting a vision to people which defines a future which they can grab onto in a mission sense to, as he says, make America great again. Now, I started out by saying I was going to compare the difference between the two coups d'etats. And here's what it is. I mentioned that Fletcher Prouty talked about the belief at the time of the Kennedy assassination of the leaders of the elite, the men and women behind the curtain, so-called, their absolute belief and definition of themselves as being a secret, largely invisible to the public eye cabal. That's why, in a certain sense, the myth that John F. Kennedy was killed by a lone assassin acting on his own and was killed solely as some type of random act of violence has persisted or been able to persist for so long in the United States. It's because people were so horrified by that event, a shocker for an entire generation. First, the president is gunned down. Then the putative assassin of the president is gunned down, all played out on national television. The presidency changes to Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy's order that we get out of Vietnam is superseded and changed the very next day. The cabinet of the United States was largely absent from the United States during that 48-hour period. So somebody knew that something was very much up. We describe a lot of the reasons for that assassination in our police dossier, But fundamentally, there's a very specific kind of relationship between John F. Kennedy and Donald Trump. Both of them challenged the American population to a new mission orientation for the entire nation, which could lift them up and over an impending dark age. In Kennedy's case, it was the space program. And it was also his determination coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis to end the period of the Cold War, which was the very premise of this rules-based international order we're talking about, is now on its last legs. That he tried to do, that he did, and that drove the elites crazy, and that determined their ability to get rid of them. And the population at that point in time exhibited a type of moral cowardice of wanting to go along to get along, of not wanting to be involved in politics, of not wanting to get in trouble, which actually was the type of culture which emerged out of World War II and represented this rules-based international order at its prime. It had the ability to eliminate its adversaries and to terrify the rest of the population into submission. When one looks at DA Jim Garrison's investigation of the Kennedy assassination, one of the stark things that strikes you is Garrison outlined that there were 22 essential witnesses to his probe, all of whom died suddenly, with very few questions actually asked. Now compare that with the coup d'etat, which began against Donald Trump in 2015, really, when this oligarchy discovered that it would be Donald Trump who would be running for the presidency of the United States. And they already knew, based on their long-term surveillance of him, that he was not controllable by them. A very essential point, that he was not controllable by them from the outset. And throughout, if you think about the time that James Comey actually confronted Donald Trump with the crazy Christopher Steele dossier, saying, we have the goods on you, and even if it's not true, we're going to circulate it anyway. And that is that, we've got you in Moscow in a sexcapade with prostitutes who peed on a bed, and that's what we're going to peddle for your inauguration. If we had been in the Kennedy years, in all probability, you would have had a president, possibly, and that's the way things were done, who would cower under that threat and would essentially say, what do I have to do to go along, to get along at this point? What do I have to do to, preserve my survival? Not only that, but Trump didn't cave, and the American population went along, a substantial and growing part of it went along with that show of courage. They themselves began to question the very foundations of what they believed in. Here's a guy who clearly is willing to give it all up, to give his life for love of this country. He's reiterated that. He's reiterated it over and over and over again. Most importantly, as people emphasize, he is afraid of nothing anymore. Why? Is it just because he's stupid? Because he's got some bald kind of innate macho senselessness about the dangers before him? No, he knows who he is. He knows that what he gives right now in this life will live long after him as an example to generations coming forth. And that is the most important element of what this life is really all about. And that in turn has inspired an entire population to take up that challenge. And it has our elites, the people who are still living back in this rules-based international order, living back in a time where they could control things, or so they thought, completely baffled and unable to respond. I think that's the key difference. It's the role of one individual in history, as LaRouche often emphasized, which makes all of the difference in the world. Now, this beast that is being taken down is wounded, which makes that beast very, very dangerous. You have them pressing for a war with Iran, which would be insane and put us on the edge of a nuclear catastrophe, because we're not in a position to wage any of these wars which they are waging in our name. We don't have the industrial capacity to actually engage in these types of wars. Our weapons have already been shown to be ridiculously outdated, ridiculously inept in the war in Ukraine. They're now being shown to be ridiculously outdated, ridiculously non-adept in the conflicts which are taking place in the Red Sea, where we're being outmaneuvered by people using very primitive drones, very primitive rocketry, but our million and billion-dollar weapons get very quickly exhausted, and we have to go back to port if we're the US Navy and somehow get reloaded rather than being able to engage in these types of battles. So we're in a very dangerous period, but it is a period in which there is vast hope. And, if people become conscious of the fact that it is actually this period where we can change everything as if in a moment, I think that can be the inspiration for each and every one of us aspiring to be Promethean, in the sense that what Prometheus represents is a method of thought, and in Mr. LaRouche's words, a method of thought which completely overturns all of these old axioms and presents something totally new and totally challenging, but also something which changes much, much for the better. So that's how I end my overview tonight and sort of open it up for questions.